Very good. I can hear you too. So I think we're getting a little crackling here. Do you think that's this mic here? Okay. Let's try again. Okay. All right. So James, welcome to the Cenic Annual Conference here in beautiful UC Davis, California.
Hi, everybody. Our weather actually might be almost as good as your weather is today.
Well, that's fabulous. I know that's not usually the case.
It sure isn't.
So thanks for joining us. This is actually a follow-up session from a performance element that we hosted here at the conference yesterday, where we used this technology, the Research Education Network, and in California that's Cenic, which stands for the Corporation for Education Network Initiatives in California. And you're coming to us over, I think it's PenRen, which is one of the affiliates of the Internet too. So last night we had a nice little session where we had 3 performance elements using this technology to have pianist Geri Allen perform with Chris Chafe of Stanford University's creative music component that blends computers with music. He was at the New World Symphony down there in Miami. And then we also had the folks from SFJAZZ, the High School All-Stars, performing. And we connected 3 Yamaha disc claviers through the network as well, and had them accompany the musicians in all locations. So it was a quite technical and fun adventure, and that's what we're following up today. Recognizing you weren't here, we won't spend all the time on it, because we want to get you...
It sounds amazing, though.
Thank you. And so the folks here, just to let you know, James Peterson, he is the director of the Africana Studies department at Lehigh University in a small town called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but they're big in terms of research and technology. So James is joining us from Lehigh over the Cenic network using our UltraGrid technology, which we also used yesterday. We have to my direct left Dr. Lewis Fox. I know you don't like to go by that, do you, Lewis? Dr. Lewis Fox. He is the CEO and president of the Cenic organization here in California, and is a huge, huge supporter of technological advances and initiatives as they relate to both culture and music, libraries. He's by far the poster child for this effort. And down to my far left is Geri Allen, Professor Geri Allen from the University of Pittsburgh on the other side of Pennsylvania. Geri is the director of the Jazz Studies program there, and a well-recognized pianist of her own right and notoriety. And so I'm happy to bring the 3 of you here together to just spend a little time in the conversation around the convergence of technology, culture, and art. So I have a couple of I thought we'd just do a little exploration. I'd throw out a few concepts and get your feedback on it. But first, I'd just like to start off with maybe a little feedback in terms of how the 2 panelists that were here last night perceived the performance elements that we had. Who shall start? Geri?
Testing.
Ah.
There we go. So how simple. I'll just turn it on, right?
Right.
So anyway, I just wanted to reiterate how exciting it is to be here and to have access to such creative students, to have access to performance opportunities over vast distances, diverse kinds of points of view around music making, and connected points of view with new colleagues, new collaborators. And I think, again, what this experience yesterday for me was very exciting to have all these 3 pianos. I understand that in the different sites, what I was playing was being translated to each of the artists that were in the different sites. So the students had a piano that was actually playing what I was playing there. So they had a live experience. And Chris, who was in Miami, also had a piano that was translating that in a live experience. So it's just some new breakthrough kind of opportunities that this whole connection of technologies are making possible, and I'm just happy to be here to witness it.
Louis, how did it occur for you?
Well, I have to say it was, it was wonderful to have the quality performance that we had at Cenic, and I thought about it in a number of ways. It seems to me that our networks are now good enough for the arts. And it's taken a while, and it kind of fits with what we're doing throughout Cenic and with our partners to try and figure out how you can get these networks to perform end to end, and so that whether it's a musical performance or a scientific instrument on one end, and an audience or a research community a research group on the other end, that the network is ultimately invisible, and people can have the resources or the experiences at either end in the quality that at a sort of level of quality that doesn't diminish across the network. So that it was exciting. We're a research community, and so if this were already production quality, if it were something that were easy to do, then we probably wouldn't be doing it. So that it was hard to do and that it had its complexities seemed perfectly in keeping with who we are and what we do. I think on another level for the Cenic community, seeing this kind of performance, seeing the new technology with the pianos, seeing what would be possible in multiple sites opens up people's imaginations. And it doesn't matter whether they're in K-12 schools or community colleges or in higher ed. And we can talk about these kinds of things, and we do talk about them, but there's absolutely no substitute for seeing it and being there. And lastly, there's something about the immediacy of jazz and the form itself that sort of brought the messages home, both about the network and about the possibilities.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap you, James, into this conversation at this point. First of all, I just want to recognize your book, The Hip Hop Underground in African American Culture. Next to Cornell, it's probably some of the most difficult reading I've done. But it's really fabulous. And one of the things that you speak of, you create this conversation around roots and railroads, which I thought quite intriguing. And I thought we might blend that with a third concept or element of networks, because they're all things that kind of connect. So I would like, if you would, just to give us a statement or so about the roots and railroads that you refer to in your book?
Sure. First, let me just thank you for having me as a part of this process. You know, I use satellite uplink technology a lot to do cable news. And I like this technology, that there's very little delay here. And I want to give a big shout out to the half a dozen people who are around here working the technology to make it work for this program. The conversation the panelists are already engaged in is one that I'm deeply interested in, because I'm the guy who goes around the country talking about the fact that our classrooms are like mausoleums. And what I mean by that is that we've got to have a communications revolution in how we teach, particularly the arts, but I would argue in arts, humanities, and sciences as well. And so in my first book, in the Hip Hop Underground and African American Culture, I'm really working through the kinds of communications revolutions that are occurring in this sort of pre-modern era. So the Underground Railroad required a linguistic sort of communications revolution, and I would argue that the way that we teach and think about pedagogy in the 21st century requires a sort of kind of technological revolution. I'll give you an example. And Mount, you already know this, I'm not really a jazz aficionado, right? And so I come to jazz music through hip-hop culture. And I would argue that hip-hop culture and rap music is a technology for jazz, which is to say that there are a whole generation of folks who experience jazz music through the filter or through the lens of hip-hop culture. And all of that has been enmeshed with and inextricably linked with the sort of technological developments on how music is produced and distributed over time. And so hip-hop has really benefited from this sort of digital transformation, the ways in which people consume music visually, all the different technological innovations in how we consume music. Hip-hop has benefited from, but it has then in turn served as a technology for jazz music. So there's so many young people who know of jazz music through hip-hop. Now, for a lot of jazz folks, that might sound like blasphemy. But I just want to give you one quick example of how some of those things work. So some of you might be familiar with a group called Tribe Called Quest, a very, very popular 90s hip-hop group. Late last night, one member of that group, who went by the name of Fife, passed away. He had a lot of problems and challenges with diabetes. And what was interesting to me is how that was communicated, right? So I learned last night on social media that this guy had passed away. And I had friends this morning sending me text messages saying, hey, did you hear that Fife Dog passed away? Did you hear this artist that passed away? It's interesting because the text even seems to be almost an outdated or outmoded form of technology for the kind of communication that we think about with respect to the arts. But as I was thinking about Fife and thinking about A Tribe Called Quest, what I realized is, number one, when I first started listening to A Tribe Called Quest, I was listening to them on vinyl and cassette. Okay. By the time they had graduated to one of their classic jazz-inflected albums, an album called The Low End Theory, we were listening to it on CDs. You know, students don't really buy CDs anymore. But I also had to remember the fact that Ron Carter, this extraordinary jazz bassist who I had never heard of before, was introduced to me through the music of A Tribe Called Quest. And so it made me think about kind of where we are today and the ways in which we're trying to use technology to push how we gain access to music and how we learn about music and how we learn about the arts, because hip-hop culture has kind of been in the center of that. You know, here you have this great rapper who passes away ahead of his time. We're commemorating his life all on social media in this particular moment, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who know of Ron Carter, this great jazz bassist, through the music of A Tribe Called Quest. And so I think the charge for us is to understand sort of how these communications revolutions work in history, and that's where the roots and routes piece comes in, Mount, because I was really trying to capture how the Underground Railroad had to use language as a form of technology in order to communicate in code in order to liberate people. Now we have all different types of technological tools that allow us to do some of those things, but I was looking back in history at some of the earlier moments where sort of soft technologies were getting us access to freedom, number one, but also access to the arts. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Fife and just to say to folks that even though I'm not like a jazz head, the reality is that what I know about jazz and what has sort of conscripted me to jazz music comes through hip-hop culture. And I would argue that hip-hop itself is sort of a technology for jazz. It's a way of communicating and conveying jazz music to a generation of listeners that sometimes feel like jazz is like America's classical music, like it's kind of high art, sort of distant and dissonant from the experience of young people today. But there are plenty of hip-hop artists who understand the role that jazz music plays in the long history of American music and American popular culture, and they literally use the technology at the disposal of hip-hop musical producers to introduce an entire, the next generations of young people to jazz music.
Got it. Geri, do you have any comments on that?
Yes, well, thank you for that eloquent comment. I remember when Ron Carter did those tracks, and there was this, for me, an excitement around this interest of this next generation of music makers in the hip-hop culture, embracing this tradition, acknowledging that they're a part of it, and wanting to connect, which I sense is an empowerment, to be able to see yourself as advancing the form, while at the same time understanding the weight of all of the connectivity that came before.
Yes.
And the very early ancient music all the way to where it is today. It could get there, and that's an empowering kind of, I would think, an empowering experience. And certainly for people like Max Roach, when the music first kind of hit, Max really embraced the music, and so there are a lot of innovative musicians from the bebop era. That's right. Who understood the, and it was like a familiar kind of, I remember this energy, I remember what this was. These young people maybe not having the same access to instruments in the way that these earlier generations, but having the same creative spirit, the same kind of genius, the same kind of advocacy and all of this that hip-hop, was expressing. So I find it exciting, again, to hear this statement around continuity and cultural memory, and that this is all connected, really. And you say that hip-hop is you use the term technology for jazz. And I see that it's true in terms of this generation. But in a sense, each era kind of presents itself in that way as African-American music evolves, where you find the older generation of musicians, some of them won't embrace the new ideas, some of them will. Someone like a Mary Lou Williams, who would have spanned the whole kind of continuum of the really early forms, like with Jelly Roll and, looking him in the eye, and all the way through to someone like a Cecil Taylor, who looked up to her, she meant kind of as a mentor to him. And she embraced Thelonious Monk, and she embraced Bud Powell. She embraced these musicians who were kind of breaking through these new barriers. And I think that puts hip-hop in a place, too. I mean, in terms of this legacy, in terms of this kind of the continuity of how this music has evolved.
It really does, and I just want to add a couple of things here, because Ms. Allen, you're really on point with what you're talking about. I mean, I remember I went to an Ideas Festival in Colorado a couple of years back, and I got into this long, protracted argument with Wynton Marsalis after his performance there. And for those of you who have been in conversation with Marsalis, he is a purist. And he really feels as if the next generation of musicians, whether they're jazz or hip-hop or whatever, have not conscripted themselves to the craft in the same ways that he was conscripted and people before him were. He's a very zealous sort of protector of a very sort of classic sense of what musicianship is. And so for him, he rejects a lot of what hip hop is. So I remember he and I going back and forth, and I'm like saying, well, what about the roots? And he's like, no, they're not really that good. Or I'm like, what about this artist? What about that artist? And he's rejecting all these artists. And what I realized was that for him, this was like a rhetorical exercise, right? Like for Marsalis, he's challenging me to think about like who are the greats from the hip hop generation. And I actually now I wish I could have that argument with him again, because I have a different sense of how to prosecute it, which is to say that we have to actually look at the artists within jazz that have been in some ways influenced by hip-hop culture. And so I'm thinking about Roy Hargrove, I'm thinking about Robert Glasper. You know, these are young folks who were, by the way, inspired by Ron Carter's role in playing the bass on those Tribe Called Quest tracks, to think about how jazz music and hip-hop culture are a part of that continuum that Ms. Allen has been talking about. But now when you look in this contemporary moment, you know, the most critically praised hip-hop album of 2015 is Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. And I don't know how familiar the audience is with that album, but that album has deep jazz roots. The studio sessions are produced and co-produced by jazz musicians. It has a very sort of jazz feel to it in terms of how democratic the way the album sort of unfolds. And I think if I could argue again with Wynton Marsalis about who are the greats to come out of hip-hop culture, I think I would think more about some of those jazz artists who have embraced hip-hop artists, and some of those hip-hop artists who have gone to jazz musicians for their own musical production.
If I could jump back in and respond to that. I came up during Motown. That was my era, right? So a lot of the musicians and jazz musicians that were in Detroit, that were my teachers, were on those tracks. So they were the instrumentalists making that music for the you know, the great vocalists we all know. And they were always really fluid about it. You know, they would go and do, like Marcus Belgrave, who we just lost, you know, was one of the Funk Brothers. So he would go in and do these sessions with, you know, Stevie Wonder or Martha Reeves or people like just, I mean, it was the community of jazz musicians that were doing that music. And then at the same time, they would go and do, you know, bar mitzvah, you know, let's go, you know, they would go do whatever music making would take us toward. We were kind of trained as young musicians to be open. So music is music. Good music is good music. And so I remember Herbie Hancock's record, Chameleon.
Exactly. That's a big record for hip-hop.
A big record, right? And so we're all listening to Motown and dancing in the street and, you know, all the different songs. I actually ended up working with Mary Wilson, by the way, you know, which was really cool. But it's for me, hearing that record with Herbie, where he kind of did what you're expressing, you know, where you have this one person who is connecting into this generation through making it a comfort zone for them to come in. You know, so we're listening to Herbie's funk, and it's like all of a sudden, oh, wow, this guy played with Miles Davis. And then, you know, you get this whole history that takes you back to the legacy. And I think that, you know, my generation has had that happen. I think those before me have had that happen, as well as, you know, this generation you're talking about with Ron Carter.
Yes.
So there's a continuity to what you described.
Yeah. I could riff on this for a long time now, so you should tell me when to shut up. But one thing that I get into in my book is I look at Thelonious Monk's album Underground, the album that won the 1968 Grammy for cover art. And I study that cover art because in the book, what I'm trying to do is think about how the concept of the underground sort of travels through different aspects of African American culture, everywhere from the Underground Railroad movement to the concept of the underground within hip hop culture itself. And that Thelonious Monk record ends up being a really, really important record because it functions as a bridge from those sort of early, because of all these great earlier moments in African American literature, like Invisible Man and The Man Who Lived Underground and Amiri Baraka's Dutchman, all of these black writers who were influenced by jazz music and talking about the underground and thinking about underground resistance movements. And then you have Thelonious Monk with this incredible sort of staged photograph of like underground resistance, and it wins the Grammy. It wins, like, it's so not underground as an album, but it's speaking to all these really important underground themes that really run through all of African American cultural production. And so I think what hip hop has to learn from jazz is right where Miss Allen is, which is we've got to understand how the collaborative and community spirit of jazz musicianship is really required in order to sustain hip hop culture going forward. That Thelonious Monk album cover and album helps us to get a sense of that. And what I try to do is connect the dots between these underground conceptualizations across the music in that book project. So the Kendrick Lamar album that won the 5 Grammys a couple of weeks ago is not produced the way most hip hop albums have been produced, because the way hip hop albums are produced in the 21st century is like the way we're using this technology right now. Someone will record something in one studio in one area of the world, someone will record a track in another area of the world, and then they'll circulate it and make the record that way. But the Kendrick Lamar's Grammy Award-winning album was not produced that way. It was produced through studio sessions. You know, it took almost 2 years to make it. It required the musicians to actually be in the studio at the same time. And so that's a very different sort of turn. And in fact, it's a counterintuitive turn away from technology for hip-hop culture, but it's towards the embracing of that sort of communal, collaborative ethos that we see running through so much of jazz music.
So hold on to that thought, because we're about to go there, but I'd also like to extend to the third parallel, and that's around the networks, because what we're speaking of is in some ways these very unique considerations around communications and creating sense of community that are virtual, and one of the opportunities, or a fundamental opportunity that is being created through the use of this technology as it's starting to trickle down, especially in the state of California, is how this technology is now becoming available in communities that historically haven't had the opportunity to have it. And that is, for instance, with all the public libraries. There's a very robust public library project taking place right now where Cenic is attempting to have libraries across the state have this technology. So, Louis, do you want to speak to that for a moment?
Just briefly, because I love the dialogue that's going on. But I don't think anybody in this room would disagree that the conversation that we're listening to, the music that we heard last night, wouldn't breathe some life into those mausoleums that were referred to earlier in the conversation, and wouldn't attract another generation into the conversation and into the community, enrich their lives and inspire them, and bring a great deal more creative life into an environment now that seems to be a lot about measurement. And as a farmer friend of mine is fond of saying, you don't fatten a cow by weighing it. And I think that's kind of where we are in education. And this technology allows us to do that. I mean, in fact, what we're doing right now will be archived and will be accessible. So, I mean, you can participate, but you can also have an opportunity to interact with the artifact if you can't participate. So, our ability to get this out and far and wide in California is really our commitment. And I'd like to also say that I think about the environment that we're in right now, where this sort of hatred and cruelty seems to be bubbling up from the surface, and you only have to read history a little bit or travel around the world to know that all kinds of chaos and brutality and atrocity can follow on that. And so I think it's our duty to think about things that, and to actively help those things that are ennobling and enriching and cause people to choose beauty and joy and compassion, as opposed to some of the direction that I think we're going right now as a nation. So I think, again, the more we can do what we did last night and what we're doing now, the better.
Can I piggyback on that just one, because I think what Dr. Fox is saying here is really, really important. And so, because I think some mornings we wake up and we're like, man, the world is just moving in the wrong direction. What we kind of have to remember is that young people are being educated around things like hate and violence through technology. So when they're learning about the terrorist attacks in Brussels, they're learning that on technological platforms. When they're seeing fights and scuffles break out at political presidential rallies, they're seeing that on their phone or on their iPad. And so technology is a platform, and a very, very persuasive one, for a lot of the more pessimistic and negative and sensational things that we see in our society. As educators, we have to understand that, because we want to meet young people where they are, and technology is one of the tools that we've got to be able to use to do that. You know, I know I'm an English PhD, so I love books. I literally love the way books smell, and I love the way they feel. But I can't be nostalgic about traditional forms of pedagogy, because the students that I'm engaging in my classrooms every day, and the students that I volunteer for when I'm in the public school systems in the Pennsylvania area, are students who are learning from screens. And so if we're really invested in thinking about how do you get young people to be constructive and positive in a world where they're inundated with sounds and images that are pejorative and negative, we have to think about how we use some of those same technologies to platform some of the things that we think of as being more constructive and educational in society.
Agreed.
Totally.
So, and I want to just go back when, just a few moments ago, we started down a course where it sounded like we were about to talk about oral traditions and pedagogy and how we communicate culture, both from the perspective of school and community instruction. I know Geri and I have had this conversation regarding the role of oral tradition in terms of music instruction, and certainly oral tradition in terms of hip hop are very closely tied. Just wondered if you had any further comments on that. Geri?
My dissertation is on the oral tradition. I could probably talk about it for a long time. Let me just say this. One of the fascinating things that Alex Haley tells us about his experience in doing the research for the book Roots is that when he goes back to the region where he thinks his family is from, and he identifies the tribe that he thinks that his family is descended from, and he has to go through this whole process where he has to wait for this opportunity to interact with and speak with a griot. And this griot is someone who essentially has the entire history of who he thinks is his family at his disposal. So Mr. Haley kind of waits the allotted time, goes through the requisite ceremonies to get access. Then he sits with the griot, and the griot reveals for him this long history of which a part his family is. And what's interesting is two things really interesting here. One, the griot has thousands of years of history at his disposal. He's an oral historian. But what gets lost sometimes is one of the ways in which he's able to retain that. One is through repetition, because he just repeats these stories over and over. But two, it's because he does so in verse. And so there's an artistic quality to how he archives that particular history. And so when you think about the griot in that way, it opens up this sort of incredible tradition in the American and particularly in the African American experience, because think of everything that comes out of that. The sermonic tradition and the preachly tradition comes out of that. The blues comes out of that. Jazz, scat, all kinds of vocal and verbal abilities. The whole idea of like playing the dozens, all of the things that we sort of think of as the comedic and the powerful sort of verbal virtuosity of the African American vernacular spoken experience comes out of that tradition. And yes, rap music and hip hop also taps into that. And so oral history is, and this is what you need to understand. I hope there's no historians in your audience, but historians in America, generally speaking, discount oral history. It requires a lot of work for a historian to instantiate an oral history as being legitimate. But the reality is that when we look over the long arc of history of the world, oral histories have been an important piece. And the technology of those oral histories is verse, right? That is how they're able to retain and contain so much information. And so when we think about that trajectory from ancient griots in Africa to modern day rappers in the 21st century, it gives you some sense of the awesome capacity of oral history to inform what we're trying to do in terms of educating young people today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very helpful, the way that you've described this. And I think the another piece is access to that information. So how do you get access to those stories? You know, and this technology that we're discussing here gives possible access to the children that you're in school volunteering with, for instance, to have access to a griot. I mean, we every time we lose a jazz musician, it's like we've lost a griot, you know, and the stories that are handed down to people who are fortunate to be close to them. It's a very special, as you're saying, you have to gain access and trust and all of that. But as we continue to lose these people, I think, or as they get to an age where they are really wanting to share those stories, where they're understanding that, you know, how those that came before them were lost and the stories went with them. And how the importance of these oral histories and having them documented, but also having this live experience with this person while they're with us, you know, and the experience that can give a child, or I don't know, to have, you know, the idea of groups of these musicians together, artists talking about memories, things that won't happen in an interview setting. Where you have this kind of spontaneous opportunity to have these musicians share, who may be too old to travel, who you know, may not want to get on planes anymore. But anyway, these are immediate needs that this technology can afford, can create access for us. So. I agree, this idea of the oral history is a huge part of how this music is passed on from generation to generation. That is changing because we don't have access as much to the older iconic musicians. They're leaving us. So, I mean, the oral history is being, I guess, within the university now, we find more of the sharing of this kind of knowledge, but it's not, you know, it's a different thing growing up, coming up around these musicians who are just staunchly holding on to community, staunchly holding on to culture. Based on, you know, years and years of transmission of this. So and unfortunately, I think we're out of time. But what James, what this says is that, you know, I've got about 5 more points that I'd like to address. So I'd like to invite you back to participate in similar conversations in the future. And Absolutely. One of those topics that, you know, Louis and I talk quite a bit about is the role of this network in historically black colleges and universities, as well as other minority service type institutions that would actually provide support for the conversation that we're having right now. So I invite you back as well, Louis and Geri. I think we're out of time. So I just would like to say thank you to the 3 of you for taking the time to begin this conversation, and look forward to continuing it in the future. And James, please give my best to the entire crew out there at Lehigh. I really appreciate that.
All right?
I will. Thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate the conversation as well.